Skipping ahead, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist, unquote. He was right. Time, as Westbrook Van Voorhis said, marches on. And today, we no longer have a military-industrial complex, but a military-industrial media-academic complex, MIMAC. We no longer have such a thing as peacetime either. Everything is bigger, and 9/11 is a paradigm example. On March 6, 2010, the reporter Russ Baker said that 9/11 was, quote, a story too big to cover, unquote. He was right too. Part of the reason that the subject is so large is the amalgamation of the media and academia. Formerly, it was the case that the aim of academia was the discovery and communication of truth, and the aim of the media was to attract or appropriate attention and then sell it, thus determining what will be talked about. The social sciences are now ingesting cultural studies and completing the merger. Soon, the more TV you watch, the more learned you will be. The University of Winchester has a Center for Conspiracy Culture, and the University of Kent's Psychology Department's search engine lists 504 sources of information on this international pathology of public reason. The controversy about 9/11 takes its place within an older encompassing literature concerned with the truthfulness of the public information that public reason relies upon, within which it may be considered a paradigm case. The Center for Conspiracy Culture had a conspiracy culture conference in 1998 in Winchester, and from March 12 through 14 of this year, the University of Miami's Department of Political Science had a conference on conspiracy theories. Of course, the intent of the conferences was not to investigate the truth of such theories. That is a job for the conspiracy theorists themselves, who in this respect may be considered more traditionally academic than the academicians. The size of the 9/11 literature now permits us to see some simple patterns with which to characterize it. In their online discussion of conspiracy theories, Michael J. Wood and Karen M. Douglas find that, quote, conspiracist commenters were more likely to argue against the opposing interpretation and less likely to argue in favor of their own interpretation, while the opposite was true of conventionalist commenters, unquote. In fact, the work of the 9/11 Consensus Panel and that of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth is entirely limited to demonstrating the falsity of the official account. The Consensus Panel has, quote, developed 44 consensus points of best evidence opposing the official account of 9/11, unquote, using a simplified Delphi method, the approach adopted by evidence-based medicine. In the footsteps of Wood and Douglas, we note impressionistically rather than statistically that conspiracists or conspiracy theorists overwhelmingly talk about the issues, while conventionalists or coincidence theorists like Wood and Douglas talk about those who talk about the issues. Throughout MIMAC, the standard approach to 9/11, as to other matters, is to report holders of beliefs and omit the reasons they hold them. If you can read 300-page tomes of vulgar twaddle and come away with no better idea of why the people under discussion say what they say than the presumption that they're all nutters. These people used to be architects and engineers, and now they wear tinfoil hats. All 2,533 of them, 2,353, excuse me. There seems to be disagreement between philosophy departments and law schools as to whether ad hominem is a fallacy. Here is Professor Mark Fenster, JD. Most 9/11 conspiracy theories contest every point, quote, most 9/11 conspiracy theories contest every point of the official account. They base this refutation on their interpretation of both forensic anomalies at the accident sites, whose existence the official account concedes and attempts to explain, and of evidence whose existence and trustworthiness the official account either rejects or ignores. Their interpretive practice, in other words, both reinterprets and finds conspiratorial details, ripping them out of their place within the official account's framework and inserting them into a conspiratorial one. The conspiracy theorists assert that any unexplained anomaly, or any anomaly for which they can provide a better explanation than the official account offers, causes the official account to fail, because each of the government's assertions requires and builds upon the truth of others. If some of the hijackers are still alive, they argue, or if the tower's collapse was not caused by the plane collisions, or if something other than American Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, then the entire official account would be revealed as a series of lies, unquote. This is quite correct. It would be. The observation of Wood and Douglas is explained by the fact that the broad term conspiracy theory addresses not specific details, but rather the structure of contemporary society. Just as one man's terrorist may be another man's freedom fighter, so one man's anomaly may be another man's epiphany. A coin is flipped. When it lands, it presents Professor Fenster with an anomaly because it landed heads, but it looks like a tail. Well, that is an anomaly. But for honest people, there is no anomaly. The controversy around 9/11 is certainly too big to cover in 60 minutes and continues to grow. The historiography of the subject distinguishes the U.S. government account and an account which denies it, thereby creating controversy. Both of these accounts stipulate that the phenomena of 9/11 were due to a conspiracy. How could one person do it? But strangely, only the side which disagrees with the government is known as a conspiracy theory, suggesting that the term is being used as an alternative name for thought crime, that is, thinking ill of the government. The government account was, of course, presented to the public first, and in it many of the phenomena of that day were advanced merely as horrifying, such as the disappearance of an immense inhabited building in 10 seconds. Only later were they recognized by the non-governmental side as anomalies. Once in a while, unpredictably, some substantively new element will be added to the non-governmental account, but the governmental side adds only new scholarly or unscholarly ad hominems. while the executive branch advocates infiltrating or criminalizing dissent. And according to MIMAC, the non-government account is old news. Within both these sides, we find three distinctions to be drawn in approaches to the subject: expert and non-expert. Physical and psychological, second distinction. And observational and testimonial, that's the third distinction. Of course, it will probably be agreed that generally speaking, expert assertions outweigh non-expert. Physical considerations outweigh psychological, and observations outweigh testimony, even at times expert testimony. And of course, experts sometimes disagree. And in that case, the non-expert must do the best she can. Coin flipping, which is both physical and observational, requires no expertise. On the non-governmental side, as well as non-experts, we find experts speaking on their subjects, that is, non-governmental sides, talking about, their subjects. They are architects, engineers, physicists, demolition contractors, airplane pilots, former spies, 08 grade military officers, firefighters, and others. What is the best part of the voluminous 9/11 controversy to examine within 60 minutes? The 9/11 consensus panel does not rank its points in order of weight or strength. For the period of time available today, we need a single issue to discuss. On the government side, we distinguish the statements of government officials from others in MIMAC who engage in defense of the official account. We will confine our attention to the statements of government officials speaking ex cathedra. Of these, only some are reputed experts on the physical aspects of what they claim. But what is the government account, and correlatively, what is the non-governmental account precisely? Determining these things can be hampered by a loose or colloquial use of language. For instance, it is often said that the Twin Towers fell. Strictly speaking, such a thing is impossible. The Twin Towers could not fall because there was nowhere for them to go. They were already sitting on the ground. Consequent on their disintegration, their parts fell. Saying simply that the Twin Towers fell obscures the fact that they had been deconstructed, had been taken to tiny pieces, had been turned into talcum powder in a matter of seconds, approximately 10 seconds each. If there is a sense in which the towers fell, they fell apart. If I can figure out how to go back here, which I probably can't. Anyway, you saw all the smoke in the first picture. This rather than smoke, it's dust. All right, shortly, we will pay attention to two other words: collapse and explode. We will use as the epitome of the 9/11 controversy a single physical contention and discuss it from an observational perspective, speaking from a non-expert standpoint. The contention is that the Twin Towers were blown up or exploded in controlled demolition. This contention does not contradict the contention that other things were also done to them. On May 10th, 2009, Richard Cheney told CBS that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, quote, blew up the World Trade Center, unquote. However, Since he was out of office when he said it, we will not count it as an official government pronouncement. The government's official position is that no explosions occurred. The National Institute of Standards and Technology's latest statement on the matter is dated September 19, 2011. It reads, quote, "In summary, NIST found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting that the WTC towers were brought down by controlled demolition using explosives," unquote. The contention that the Twin Towers were blown up or exploded captures the essential opposition between the governmental and non-governmental accounts in the following way. If demolition could be arranged, there would be no need for airplanes. Why train scarce suicide warriors so intensively and then risk losing them at the airport if you can accomplish their task in some other way? Why have airplanes strike the buildings and then blow them up, wasting the pilots? That thought indeed is prima facie incoherent. It leaves one with the stark realization that if the buildings were blown up, then the reason for the airplanes was to camouflage precisely the fact that they were blown up. Suicide missions leave no one to apprehend and question, but controlled demolitions do. A few suicide pilots are long gone, but many highly trained demolition workers and enablers remain, with their countless connections to secret sponsors. Had they been discovered, had they been so much as looked for, justice could have been sought from individuals, possibly, instead of from countries. Parties to such camouflage share the guilt and possibly the profit of the action itself, and would be expected to maintain indurate denial that the buildings were blown up. Demolition of the sort interrogated here would require state-of-the-art expertise and equipment, considerable access to the premises, and months, if not years, of preparation, all of which we must suppose were unavailable to Al-Qaeda, but not to people with connections to some state or states, to the security company of the World Trade Center, or to the proprietor until 6 weeks before the event of that unprofitable piece of property, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. As Dr. Alan Sabrowski has observed, if Islamic terrorists had had the ability to blow up the World Trade Center in the heart of New York City in 2001, the Green Zone in the heart of Baghdad would be a pile of rubble today. The question of demolition or no demolition decides the question of government truth or truth, of conspiracy theory as regards 9/11. In other words, it determines whether 9/11 was the reason for war or war was the reason for 9/11. NIST had conducted investigations of disasters at least since the 1967 collapse of the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with no specific authorizing legislation. In 1985, when it was still known as the National Bureau of Standards, it was authorized to do so by Public Law 99-73, which also, incidentally, protected its actions from judicial discovery and examination. Public Law 99-73, July 29, 1985, quote, Section 7, the National Bureau of Standards, on its own initiative, but only after consultation with local authorities, may initiate and conduct investigations to determine the causes of structural failures in structures which are used or occupied by the general public. No part of any report resulting from such investigation shall be admitted as evidence or used in any suit or action for damages arising out of any matter mentioned in such report, unquote. If no information discovered by the agency could be used in a court of law, it is apparently protected from suit. However, agency information was still subject to the 1966 Freedom of Information Act. On May 9, 2002, H.R. 4687, the National Construction Safety Team Act, was introduced into Congress, specifying that, quote, D, public safety information, a National Construction Safety Team and the National Institute of Standards and Technology shall not publicly release any information it receives in the course of an investigation under this Act if the director finds that the disclosure of that information might jeopardize public safety, unquote. Such a bill was obviously unnecessary to permit this to investigate 9/11, but it began its investigation only on August 21st, 2002, nearly a year later. 3 months after this legislation was introduced, the bill specifically authorizing secrecy on extremely vague grounds became law on October 1st, 2002, less than 2 months after NIST began its investigation. NIST's statements and proceedings were then protected both from judicial discovery and examination, and, if need be, from the Freedom of Information Act. If facts are deliberately kept secret, obviously they are dangerous to someone. But if facts about building construction could jeopardize public safety, wouldn't they be dangerous only if they weren't known? Why keep them secret from the building industry? NIST is not an intelligence gathering agency confronting foreign adversaries and protecting its, quote, sources and methods, unquote. Why would it need to classify information? On July 9, 2009, Dr. Patrick Gallagher, acting as director of NIST, used the legislation. Quote, the goals of the investigation of the WTC disaster were to investigate the building construction, the materials used, and the technical conditions that contributed to the outcome of the WTC disaster, to serve as the basis for improvements in the way buildings are designed, constructed, maintained, and used. Skipping ahead, the specific objectives were: 1, determine why and how WTC-1 and WTC-2 collapsed following the initial impacts of the aircraft, unquote. We see from this that NIST's plan was never to investigate what happened. The stated purpose of the investigation was not to determine whether the buildings collapsed or not. It was to determine how they collapsed. With regard to the question of what happened to the buildings, this is called petitio principii, begging the question. Quote, the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity in this report, this sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, although it includes little analysis of the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable, unquote. The original version of this footnote said that no analysis was included. And in a subsequent letter to Dr. Judy Wood, NIST says, quote, to facilitate communication, the term collapse, as used in this letter and in NC Star 1, means a falling in, loss of shape, or reduction to flattened floor or rubble of a structure. As stated in NC Star 1, NIST only investigated the factors leading to the initiation of the collapses of the WTC towers, not the collapses themselves, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, these statements make no sense. If you do not investigate the effect, how can you find out what caused it? How can you, quote, determine how the collapses occurred, unquote, if you do not look at them? How do you determine the cause of an event if you do not look at the event? If you do not investigate the so-called collapse, you do not know what factors led to it, and you do not even know whether it was a collapse. If, nevertheless, you write a lengthy report on those factors, you have not investigated anything. You have made it all up. These are simply facts about the word investigate. Dr. Gallagher's finding reads, quote, therefore, NIST shall not release the following information. 1. All input and results files of the ANSYS 16-story collapse initiation model with detailed connection models that were used to analyze the structural response to thermal loads, that is the load on a structure induced by change in temperature. Break element, which is an HTML feature, source code, ANSYS script files for the break elements, custom executable ANSYS file, and all Excel spreadsheets and other supporting calculations used to develop floor connection failure modes and capacities. 2. All input files with connection material properties and all results files of the LS-DYNA 47-story global collapse model that were used to simulate sequential structural failures leading to collapse, and all Excel spreadsheets and other supporting calculations used to develop floor connection failure modes and capacities, unquote. Dr. Gallagher found that all the information put into and gotten out of the collapse models and connection models, and all the calculations used to model floor connection failure, in other words, everything that NIST did, might jeopardize public safety if it were known to the public. This is supposed to be precisely the information which would enable those, quote, improvements in the way buildings are designed, constructed, maintained, and used, unquote, which were the reason for the investigation. It cannot be introduced in court and cannot be accessed with a FOIA request. If there are facts about construction which might jeopardize public safety, shouldn't the building trades be made aware of them? NIST was investigating office buildings, not atom bombs. Why go looking for information to make improvements with if such information is itself somehow dangerous? Unless it was all just theater to begin with. Kevin Ryan was an employee of Underwriters Laboratory with access to NIST's tests and computer models. According to him, in the documentary Zero, NIST falsified both input and output for their models, doubling some experimental quantities and halving others, and still could not achieve their desired results. We ask, why model anything? Why not simply look at what happened, if you are being honest? The time now to simplify matters, as promised. To do that, we utilize a new resource, the gift of time and industry, the conspiracy photograph. According to Dr. Cass Sunstein, Those who, quote, those who subscribe to conspiracy theories may create serious risks, including risks of violence, and the existence of such theories raises significant challenges for policy and law, unquote. Perhaps transferring the attention of such subscribers from dubious theories to undoubted photographs may mitigate the seriousness of the risks. Adopting the unusual usage of the term conspiracy, which has been noted, conspiracy photographs are not photos of the airplane strikes. They are the ones taken an hour later, after the collapse initiation, beyond which NIST's investigation did not go. If you have already seen two of them. Let's see. They explain wordlessly a great deal about NIST's failure to examine the collapses and refusal to reveal what it did do. As Dr. Sivaraj Shyam Sundar, director of NIST's engineering laboratory, told the Associated Press, quote, "The obvious stares you in the face," unquote. Pardon me a second. If the term collapse, as used in Ms. Fletcher's letter to Dr. Wood and in NC Star 1, meant only a reduction to flattened form or rubble, then we could speak of the collapse of Hiroshima. It must mean more. What does collapse mean in English? Here are some facts about it according to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. Quote, 1, intransitive, to fall together as the sides of a hollow body or the body itself by external pressure or withdrawal of the contents, as when an inflated bladder is pierced. To fall into a confused mass or into a flattened form by loss of rigidity or support. To break down, give way, fall in, cave in. To shrink suddenly into a smaller volume, contract, unquote. There are some collapsed buildings. These buildings have changed their shape, but they have not lost all shape or been reduced to flattened form or rubble. The buildings look less fallen in than fallen over, but assuming with Ms. Fletcher that a collapse is a falling in, is this a collapse? Is that a falling in? Are the sides of this body falling together by external pressure? Does in mean out? Is this building shrinking suddenly into a smaller volume? Contracting? Here is the demolition of the Blanchette Bridge in St. Charles, Missouri on December 4, 2012. Let me point out some things. These things. You see them? All over. Here's one, here's another, etc. All right. Is there any resemblance between the controlled demolition of this bridge And this building now, what does explode mean? Here is the relevant OED definition. Quote, 5, intransitive, to go off with a loud noise of gas, gunpowder, etc., to expand violently with a loud report under the influence of suddenly developed internal energy, hence of a charged jar, mine, etc., of a boiler, gun, etc., to fly in pieces, burst from a similar cause, unquote. Collapses and explosions are alike in that both involve loss of rigidity or support. But collapses are down and in, and explosions are up and out. In this regard, they are like heads and tails. In fact, collapses are implosions. Were these buildings falling in or flying to pieces? Were they shrinking suddenly into a smaller volume or expanding violently, bursting? Here is the friable fabric of a steel skyscraper in process of disappearing. Has there ever before been anything like this on Earth? A skyscraper has turned into a dust fountain. This dust is not obscuring a building behind it. When it blows away, there is no building there. The dust is the building. The construction has suddenly become a concrete one-hoss shay. Steel beams have changed into ropes of sand, and the edifice has become a sand castle. As to rigidity or support, the thing might as well be cotton candy or Alka-Seltzer. No wonder NIST did not analyze its structural behavior. Plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Pedagogically speaking, here is my favorite photo. It is a moment taken from a video. Much can be learned from it. Note the object in the upper right quadrant at the mouth of the wedge formed by the dust, high in splendid isolation against the azure sky, right there. Okay? It is one of the sections of aluminum cladding which covered the exterior of the building. What is the most reasonable explanation of how it got there? Does shrink mean expand? Does in mean out? Does down mean up? Ike's farewell warned us about a disaster, but did not tell us how to recognize it. Washington's farewell had done that, and Orwell had described its linguistic indications. How many fingers is O'Brien holding up? Experience suggests that the only sort of answer to what has just been presented is immediately to begin talking about something else, to introduce as many other subjects as possible, and to repeat oneself as many times as necessary. emphasizing the unimportance, indeed the triviality, of what the photographs show. Claim that everything said and shown here has all been disproven somewhere. Defame, insult, and threaten the person presenting the information. The more often such an answer appears in the media, the more cogent it will be. Such answers address and proceed from a different part of the brain or mind than the part I have been addressing. But more effective than any answer is the simple expedient of ignoring the whole thing. Repression may be diagnosed both in the individual patient and in society. When NIST said that it found no corroborating evidence for controlled demolition using explosives, it lied. I have adverted to the concepts of public reason and of public information. I must now add the concept of the public lie, found both in Plato and in Dr. Karen Davisha's new examination of Russia, where less money is spent to convince and to appear honest. It is advanced in the confidence that, if not believed, it will nevertheless be accepted. In 1986, historian Richard Rhodes wrote of, quote, a separate secret state with separate sovereignty linked to the public state through the person and by the sole authority of the president, unquote. And 2 years later, McGeorge Bundy said that, quote, secrecy had become a state of mind with a life and meaning of its own, unquote. I close with a 1906 quote from Georg Simmel, who presciently addresses the remarks of Professors Wood, Douglas, and Fenster. Quote, the specific nature of the lie is not exhausted in the fact that the person to whom the lie is told has a false conception of the fact. This is a detail in common with simple error. The additional trait is that the person deceived is held in misconception about the true intention of the person who tells the lie. Veracity and mendacity are thus of the most far-reaching significance for the relations of persons with each other. Sociological structures are most characteristically differentiated by the measure of mendacity that is operative in them, unquote. NIST's information cannot be subjected to legal discovery and examination. In the sole discretion of one person, any fact or number of facts it allegedly discovers may legally be kept secret, and whether there are such facts is beyond society's ability to determine. Details of building construction are matters of national security and must be kept classified. These things bespeak an information or privacy asymmetry which constitutes a sociological and agnotological structure of some interest, portending perhaps a widespread epistemological crisis, a crisis of public authority, a challenge for policy and law. In the 19th and much of the 20th century, 3 subjects were understood as not to be introduced in polite conversation: sex, religion, and politics. Every child must endure what Freud called a sexual enlightenment. During the long 18th century, the West underwent its religious enlightenment, not without resistance, some of which persists today. September 11, 2001 marks the beginning of its political enlightenment. The obvious stares you in the face. Thank you. Questions? Yes, sir.
Why would NIST have an interest in suppressing facts? I mean, what's the reason behind it?
As an organization, NIST has no such interest. The people in that organization who want to make a career for themselves have a definite interest in playing ball. NIST will tell you the truth about all kinds of things, but they have gotten the word what to say about 9/11. Many bad things can happen to people in a whole spectrum of possibilities. And if you are a career-minded person, all you have to do is whisper in somebody's ear. Is that a sufficient answer? Yes, sir.
So you're saying that the plane did hit. So you're saying that somebody knew the plane was going to hit, and when they, at a certain point, they did a controlled demolition somewhere maybe 20 floors below the main explosion or something, or where the plane hit.
Yes. Yes, sir.
I got in late. Did you say anything about Building 7?
I'm sorry,
I said I got in late. Did you say anything about Building 7, which did not?
No, I did not mention Building 7.
That's that?
There's too much to cover.
Well, no plane hit it and it went down.
Yes, it certainly did. It went down. It was broadcast on television as having gone down. It was said to have gone down 20 minutes before it actually did go down. Yes, sir.
If we have to accept the fact that it was demolished, what is the reason for even demolition of such a magnificent? I know you mentioned something about the fact that they were having financial difficulty, the owners. I mean, was that a particular reason for demolishing that?
Oh, the owners benefited certainly, and many politicians of different countries benefited. In other words, many defense contractors benefited. When Benjamin Netanyahu, whose picture is on the wall outside, was asked about 9/11, his immediate unthought response was, "It's very good. It's very good." It was very good for Israel. As far as increasing militarism, the spirit that, hey, it's time to go to war and get some more money to our friends in the defense industry. There was a question back there, ma'am.
Actually, there's a couple of comments. One is that, I don't know whether you mentioned that the owners of the building took out an insurance policy that I believe was double the value of the buildings shortly before the event. Also, that in the actual 9/11 Commission report, the engineers repeatedly stated that they could not explain how the buildings collapsed. It didn't make sense. I read part of the report, so, you know, they kept saying, well, there's no explanation, we can't explain the impacts. So, you know, it's there.
Thank you.
Can you repeat that? I couldn't hear what you said.
Oh, she was saying that NIST initially said that they could not explain how the buildings collapsed. And it took them quite a while to come up with something.
Well, I mean, even in the final report.
Yes, ma'am. Let me finish up with this lady in the back. Could you speak louder, please?
Even in the final report, the engineers who wrote the report, even in the final report, it says They cannot, there's a lot of things they can't explain, and they kept saying, you know, and it's a minor sentence after trying to, you know, explain everything, they can't explain it. There is no explanation that fits the facts, why the buildings are collapsed, and the engineer specifically stated that in the official 9/11 commission report. But most people don't see that, most people didn't read the report, you know, so.
Well, let me just add my, the way I approach it. It is hard to explain how something goes like this when you see it going like this.
Oh, but it didn't go like that. It went like this.
It went like that,
You think so?
down 3 stories at a time. That is the same building as the previous photograph. That is the one that turned into the fountain of dust. And before it did that, you see that piece of the building sitting all by itself there, out in the middle of nowhere. It did not collapse into that position. It was blown into that position. Yes, yes, ma'am.
Many years after 9/11, there was a documentary on PBS. An engineer tried to explain the way they built this building, how this collapse happened. They said when the plane hit the building, there was a fire that melted the structural support on the lower floors. And then when the floor collapsed on it, the support could not hold the weight. And then once it went down, 1 floor, 2 floor, 3 floor, there was no support on the lower floor that can take the weight of the collapsing floors. And that's why it went down like this. And they say for World Trade Center, the way they designed the building is they use less structure support. That's why they can go so high, because it's less heavy.
There was
It's
also
less
a radio.
steel.
Well, wait, please, let's have one person speak at a time. Were you finished, ma'am?
Yeah, that's why how they explain how the building pancaked down.
Okay, I
And
believe
there's so much pressure, that's why everything went to dust.
I believe the lady in back of you had something to say.
That's a steel building.
Could you speak loud, please?
All right, that's a steel building. I'm just gonna use this analogy. You ever lit a candle, a nice tall candle? When you light it at the top, it doesn't collapse at the bottom. If the fire is 100 stories up, the entire building is not gonna collapse at free fall if it's steel. It doesn't happen, it's not physically possible. If you wanna see this happen, look at some old YouTube videos of when they collapse hotels in Las Vegas. It looks exactly like that. That's exactly what it looks like. It collapses into its own footprint. It's got a big cloud of dust. That's how it happens. I mean, physically, steel structures don't do that by themselves. Not from any weight, but from some fire at the 100th floor. It just doesn't happen that way. It's physically impossible.
Yes, ma'am.
How hot does jet fuel burn compared to a candle?
Compared to a candle. You need something, this is very inaccurate.
They intentionally flew planes that were full.
Yes, and when the planes hit, you saw the explosion. That was jet fuel. Okay, the NIST itself says the jet fuel was gone. It was burned up within about 10 minutes. It was gone. And the buildings were constructed to New York's fire safety code. Everything in the buildings was checked as to fire safety. Nothing could burn so hot. Well, if you have no structural support, the thing has turned into sand or dust. What does that in seconds? Not fire.
Chemical reaction.
Yes,
How can we accept that it imploded? Because there are hundreds and hundreds of people working there. They would have seen explosives being strapped on. Nobody saw that. So how can we accept the fact that it was imploded by explosives?
there was extensive building and what you call it, remodeling or reconstruction work going on in the buildings, and those workers were not interfered with. they went to the inside of the building, and no one in there knew what they were doing. They were doing their jobs. It's not your business to ask them, exactly what are you doing, sir? And there was also reports, eyewitness reports of extensive numbers of people entering the buildings, like at 2 in the morning, every day for weeks, 2 in the morning, okay, and doing something or other.
Overtime.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Were they doing that in building 7 also?
Could you say that again, please?
Were they working on building 7 also?
They had, when they put in Mayor Giuliani's bunker in the middle of the building, that work was all done very under tight security. And those workers had free run of the building. Now, that building did not collapse or was not exploded from the top down. It was exploded at the bottom, like most conventional demolitions, and that's where you had your pancaking. It crumbled into the ground. Let me also add that, at least as far as the Twin Towers are concerned, the demolition industry has a rule of thumb about how much rubble is left of a building after it's been demolished. It's a certain percent. I think it's around between 12 or 15, something like that. And the percentage of rubble that was left of the 2 towers was significantly less than ordinary controlled demolition produces. Thank you for your attention.